As soon as Ning Que's words left his mouth, he spread his arms in the fine rain, clenched his fists, and raised them upwards, revealing his not-so-muscular chest and arms, striking a rather comical pose. Then he shouted loudly, "If I can't make something of myself in Chang'an, I won't come back." The moment those words were spoken, it felt as if a storyteller had just struck the opening gong of a play, or like a bloody severed head had been thrown heavily to the dust. The crowd along the roadside erupted in cheers, laughter, and applause, and the atmosphere immediately became lively. In the only decent tavern in Viking, Ma Shixiang and several trusted officers were drinking. The nobles hadn't asked them to send Ning Que off, and they couldn't be bothered to do so. However, they clearly saw the scene unfolding before them. One of the officers, hearing Ning Que's bold words from atop the carriage, couldn't help but sigh and say, "If he can't make something of himself, he won't come back. This kid ... looks like he really won't be coming back." At the table, Ma Shixiang, listening to the 3 short sentences Ning Que had spoken to him the night before, gently stroked his floral mustache, feeling a sense of satisfaction in his heart. He watched the carriage gradually moving away, a smile appearing on his face as he muttered softly, "It's fine if you don't come back. You little rascal, go out and stir things up in the world." As they left Viking and gradually moved farther from the grassland borders, the spring drought faced by the barbarian tribes and the newly appointed Khan did not affect this area. The spring breeze blew gently, and the leaves began to turn green. Hoofs and wheels passed by, leaving varying depths of marks on the grass, while a few butterflies fluttered around, chasing the mild wind. The carriage sped through the meadows and hills. The soft ropes tightened at times, resembling iron chains, and loosened at others, like falling leaves. Inside the carriage, the luxurious seats, layered with cotton blankets and quilts, swayed gently with the jolts of the vehicle. The delicate-looking maid quietly gazed out the window, her eyes clouded with a hint of confusion. Perhaps she was thinking about the distant northern lands, where yellow sand danced in the wind. Her face showed a subtle stiffness, but there was also a vague sense of anticipation and longing for the unknown future. In the carriage, a small boy dressed in luxurious furs tightly clutched her leg, raising his face with a look of longing. He mumbled in the Central Plains dialect, seemingly wanting to go out and play for a while. The maid turned around, scolding him sternly for a moment. Then her expression softened as she pulled him into her arms and gently ruffled his hair. A corner of the carriage curtain was lifted by the wind, and the spring breeze brushed her face, which was no longer as soft and fair as it once had been. The maid slightly squinted her eyes, staring ahead at the front of the convoy. Her face wore a faintly serious expression. At the very front of the convoy, in a simple cart, sat a young soldier named Ning Que. He was nodding off at the cart's axle, looking as though he was about to fall asleep. As the guide of the convoy, he should have been leading the way, but in reality, he spent most of the time dozing off, looking far from being a competent leader. The maid's expression was cold, not because Ning Que was dozing off at the cart's axle, but because she noticed a detail in the scene before her. Ning Que was sitting on the axle of the cart, looking as if he might fall off at any moment. Sang Sang had been vigilantly watching over him, trying her best to support his frail body. Her small face was dark and difficult to read, but from her actions, it was clear that she was extremely exhausted. At that moment, the convoy passed over a shallow grass stream, and the jolt of the cart woke Ning Que from his nap. He rubbed his eyes, glanced up at the sky, and realized that it was just about dusk when he woke up. He then raised his hand to signal the convoy to stop and prepare to set up camp. Although it might seem rash and irresponsible to immediately set up camp after just waking up, no one in the convoy voiced any objections to his decision. Since leaving Viking, every decision made by Ning Que had been proven right through practical experience. Whether it was the route choice, the camp arrangement, security measures, water and food supplies, or even the evacuation plans, nothing had been overlooked. What was even more admirable was that the convoy was traveling faster than expected. The several tribal horse bandits, recruited by the noble woman on the grasslands, had initially looked down upon the border troops of Viking. But now, their view of the young soldier leading them had completely changed, and they now admired his abilities. By the creek, the people in the convoy were silently busy with various tasks: digging, building stoves, gathering firewood, boiling water, all in an orderly fashion. The maid stepped out of the carefully protected luxury carriage, her gaze sweeping over to the young Ning Que, who was leisurely lying on the grass, preparing to eat hot pot. Her eyes then lingered for a moment on the small, frail maid, Sang Sang, who was struggling to fetch water, set up the pot, and gather firewood. Her brows furrowed tighter, and a hint of displeasure flashed in her eyes. Nearby, a sturdy bodyguard stood up and glanced at her. The maid gently shook her head, signaling for him not to follow. She then walked along the creek, past the cooking smoke, and headed toward Sang Sang. She had to admit that this boy named Ning Que did indeed possess considerable ability, far surpassing those noble sons from Chang'an who considered themselves talented. If he truly were a young master from Chang'an, she might have appreciated his manners despite his posturing, but the reality was that he was just a crude boy from a lowly background, who, in turn, exploited the maid who should be sharing in his hardships. Unconsciously, this triggered some sensitive thoughts in her, leaving her displeased. Sang Sang glanced at Ning Que, saw him nod, and silently walked over to the maid. The delicate maid took a white handkerchief from her waist, but Sang Sang gently shook her head. Despite having just completed so many heavy tasks, there wasn't a single bead of sweat on her small, delicate forehead. At that moment, Ning Que finally got up from the grass, brushed off the grass bits from his clothes, wiped the green grass stains from his cotton shirt, and smiled while giving a polite bow. The maid didn't turn to look at him and spoke in a cold tone. "I don't like you, so there's no need for you to be nice to me. People like you may seem innocent and gentle on the surface, but deep down, you are filled with stale and outdated airs, which are rather repulsive." Her voice was calm, without any fluctuation, and her slightly raised chin exuded an innate sense of superiority. As a maid serving the princess of the Tang Empire, she could command most of the empire's officials, let alone someone like Ning Que, a commoner. Ning Que smiled and shook his head, not saying much. He turned and walked toward the earthen stove by the creek. He only had one maid, while the noble woman had countless maids. One of the noble woman's maids had pulled Sang Sang aside to talk, while the noble woman had many attendants to serve her. Ning Que, on the other hand, was left alone to gather firewood, boil water, and cook. Perhaps the wines and sand of the border had gradually made Ning Que thick-skinned. There was no trace of embarrassment in his smile. As the last rays of the setting sun faded, Sang Sang returned, holding a pile of dried milk and snacks. Ning Que was staring blankly at a bowl of burnt meat porridge. When he saw her approach, he took the snacks without hesitation, quickly stuffing them into his mouth, and mumbled, "Why does she like to talk to you so much? Doesn't she realize I haven't had a proper meal in days?" This kind of self-righteous sympathy from the nobility is misplaced. Look at how she smiles, like a Wolf grandmother wanting to eat a little girl so gentle and proper it makes me sick. More fake than the watered-down wine at the tavern in Viking. She's not a bad person. Sang Sang lowered her head to pick up the burnt porridge next to him. As she was about to lift the curtain and leave, Ning Que suddenly called out to her. "What have you two been talking about these past few days?" he asked. Sang Sang furrowed her long, thin brows, seemingly trying to recall. After a moment of silence, she replied, "Well, you know I don't like to talk. Most of the time, it's her talking about things on the grassland. As for what exactly she said, I can't really remember." Hearing Sang Sang's answer, Ning Que's mood lifted instantly. He hummed a little tune, chewing on the delicious dried milk, and said with a smile, "Next time you talk to her, remember to ask for some money, or at least bring back more dried milk." As night fell, the camp grew quiet. Sang Sang used the stream water to douse the campfire, checking it carefully to make sure it was completely extinguished before dragging the hot water bucket toward the tent. A few people sitting on the slope near the stream watched her actions and silently mocked her, knowing full well that the little maid was preparing foot bath water for Ning Que. Regardless, all the contempt was directed at Ning Que. After the foot bath, Ning Que crawled into the woolen mattress, pulling the cold little feet into his arms, letting out a low groan that seemed to be both enjoyment and pain. After yawning twice, he whispered, "Sleep." Sang Sang, who had been busier than him during the day, soon fell into a deep sleep. However, Ning Que, unbeknownst to himself, opened his eyes again. His gaze passed through the scarred tent, beyond its top cover, toward the starry sky, and then landed on a handkerchief. He recalled the golden-edged handkerchief the maid had taken from her waist, confirming his suspicion in his mind. But he didn't know now that he had guessed. What would it matter? Ning Que gazed at the top of the tent, his mind drifting back over the details of their journey since leaving Viking. Throughout the journey, the luxurious carriage had always kept its curtains tightly drawn. Except for the young boy, who clearly had some barbarian blood, occasionally getting out to play, no one could see inside the carriage. The only person who occasionally gave orders was the proud, delicate maid. For some reason, that maid seemed to always call Sang Sang over to chat. What puzzled Ning Que even more was that the maid seemed to harbor a strong dislike for him. Ning Que thought she was a rather skilled actress. Whether in Viking or on the road, whether surrounded by the men of the grasslands or in the expressions and mannerisms she displayed herself, it was hard for him to believe she was just a maid. This made him feel a little strange. He had always thought that the upper nobility of the Tang Empire wouldn't have so much time to pay attention to servants like Sang Sang. However, despite his confusion, Ning Que knew that these weren't the things that concerned him the most. Throughout these few days of travel, his attention had always been on the elderly man in the old robe. If his guess was correct, the gentle-faced old man was the high-ranking expert from the southern gate of Heotian Dao that General Ma had mentioned. Since childhood, Ning Que had been determined to enter the mysterious world of cultivation, but he had never been able to find a way into that world. He was willing to follow this caravan to the capital because among them was a true cultivator. Unfortunately, along the journey, he had not found an opportunity to communicate with the elderly man who was being tightly protected. The only few interactions had been during meals at the campsite, when they would occasionally make eye contact. In those moments, Ning Que seemed to see a gentle and kind gaze from the old man, even carrying a hint of encouragement. This detail left him deeply confused, with many guesses in his mind, yet the mystery remained unsolved. Unable to clear his thoughts, Ning Que refocused his attention and looked down, only to find that the small feet in his arms were still as cold as ice, never warmed. The chill spread to his chest and abdomen, causing him to furrow his brows and feel a faint sense of worrying. Sang Sang, the little maid, had suffered too much hardship from an early age. She had once been surrounded by the wind, rain, and the stench of decay, trapped among a pile of dead bodies by the roadside for days. After Ning Que found her and took her in, she fell gravely ill, spending months without recovery. The military doctor in Viking had treated her, and Ning Que even took her to Kaiping Prefecture to see renowned doctors. All the physicians agreed. Sang Sang was born with a frail constitution, her body naturally cold, and she suffered from a congenital deficiency.